Upon taking command of the Continental Army, George Washington knew that he had embarked on a monumental task. Not only was he now shouldering the resistance against Great Britain in order to secure American independence, but he was in charge of a military force whose skills were doubtful and whose support came from a varied group of colonists whose resolve to the cause was still unknown. Nevertheless, he accepted the position knowing full well that he and his men were at an immediate disadvantage. Washington himself had wartime experience, but the majority of his men were new to war and desperately needed to be trained. Washington understood this, but he also realized that he was not only fighting against the best trained military in Europe, he was also fighting against time. He quickly concluded that his best option for victory lay not in the hands of the newly formed army, but in the information gathered by his secret army. Both the Americans and the British employed spies and utilized their services. On paper, the British should have had the upper hand. After all, they had more experience with spies, not to mention the fact more money to pay their spies. On the other hand, the colonists up to this point in their history had no reason to spy. Therefore, their experience and familiarity in the art of espionage was non-existent. Combine this with the fact that money was excruciatingly tight and the Americans were left sorely lacking. Understanding the deficits he faced, Washington committed to the use of spies from the beginning of the war and used them to the end of the war 8 years later. In an environment full of suspicion, speculation, and the ever-present threat of informers, the use of spies was risky, yet vital to help ensure victory over the British. Some spies were famous, such as Nathan Hale, the 21-year-old captain who volunteered to cross into New York, only to be found out and executed without trial 6 days later. Some spies were infamous, like Benedict Arnold, hero of Saratoga, whose ego and greed led him to sell out not just his country, but the cause he had fought so bravely to defend. Some spies, such as the Culper Ring, consisting of Benjamin Talmadge, Andrew Woodhull, Caleb Brewster, and Robert Townsend, worked together like a well-oiled machine over the course of the entire war. But these men were just the tip of the espionage iceberg, which also included women, children, and slaves. Spycraft, both old and new, were utilized by Washington. Dead drops, ciphers, codes, sympathetic stains, black chambers, and flags of truce were all in Washington's bag of tricks. But they were also in the British bag of tricks. So if both sides knew the tricks of the trade, how can it be determined that, as British Major George Beckwith stated, quote, George Washington did not really outfight us, he simply outspied us, end quote. Well, several things played into this. First, Washington was absolutely resolved to fight until independence was achieved. That resolve drove not only his army, but also what he required from his spies, accurate information given in a timely manner. Second, Washington systematically cross-referenced every piece of intel he received in order to verify the accuracy of what he was being told. If there was a shadow of a doubt, then he disregarded it. Third, Washington delegated spy master responsibilities to people such as Benjamin Talmadge, who he knew he could fully trust, and allowed them to do their job, while at the exact same moment kept an intentional, proactive gauge on what was going on within the spy networks. Fourth, Washington, despite his reputation for always being truthful, masterfully used deception in several key campaigns in order to trick the British. Fifth, Washington utilized the information he was given to know when to fight or when it was necessary to retreat in order to live to fight another day. In other words, he used the intel to help in his decision-making. Conversely, the British were sorely unaware that the war in which they were fighting was unlike the European wars they were used to. They believed and acted upon what they had always done. This led to what Kenneth Dagler said was an interesting degree to which the British civilian and military leaders chose to ignore intel in their decision-making. Though King George spared no expense for those in his espionage networks, the information they gathered was not utilized to its full potential, rendering it useless. The ability of Washington to assess each situation based on the intel he had received and then proceed accordingly is what won the intel war and ultimately the entire revolution. Washington was a talented, innovative, and aggressive intel manager that used his abilities to outspy the British and gain America her independence.